Welcome back to CBS Mornings. Since the pandemic began, certain types of violent crime have been on the rise in this country. We're learning more about the impact of that violence on victims' families, including those in law enforcement. In 2020, we saw the highest numbers of gun murders in America since 1968, a 34% increase from the year before. Jeff Pegues spoke with two men working to help victims of violent crime. They're both profoundly shaped by their own family's experience with it.
Losing a loved one to murder is the worst thing that could ever happen to anybody.
Sergeant Ben Brown solves homicides in Prince George's County, Maryland.
I never thought it would touch me in my personal life.
In 2020, the senseless violence he usually fights in the streets hit home for him and his wife, Donna. Their 17-year-old son, Bradley, was gunned down steps from their house. Police say Bradley was selling THC vape cartridges when his killers tried to rob him, and he died in the family's driveway.
I go out there almost every day, and I have the thoughts of him laying there.
With rising crime and homicides in cities and towns across America, more victims and families are faced with grief that the legal system is often unable to heal. 50% of all homicides across the country went unsolved in 2020. And even for the cases that are cracked, the road to justice can still be painfully long. One of the men involved in Bradley's death has been sentenced to life in prison, but another suspect goes on trial later this year, more than 2 years after the crime. Do you think at times victims are forgotten in this talk about rise in crime across the country?
Unfortunately, all too frequently.
Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Polite leads the Justice Department's criminal division. This year, his office has brought in its first victim rights coordinator.
The reality is that the criminal justice system often doesn't provide enough. I can't bring back a loved one to a family, no matter what sentence the criminal justice system imposes.
Polite grew up in New Orleans' Lower Ninth Ward. He is a prosecutor who sees violent crime through the eyes of law enforcement and victims.
I lost my half-brother to the streets of New Orleans very violently as well.
Growing up, his family kept him on track. He credits a mother who was dedicated to his success and a father who was a 37-year veteran of the New Orleans Police Department. But Polite says his half-brother's murder is why he's working at the Justice Department.
I think his death in a lot of ways shaped me and led me to want to become a prosecutor.
Polite says victims are at the center of the work that his office is doing. The criminal division is updating its victim policies and procedures, including possible legislative changes to victims' rights statutes. Do you have the resources that you need?
We could absolutely use more to ensure that we are bringing those victims into our work as early as possible, making sure that our decision-making is being informed by their interests.
He says mistrust of police by minority communities is one of the hurdles he's trying to tackle.
I've seen the worst of law enforcement. I've seen what it means for victims not to come forward. I've seen what it means for witnesses not willing to come into a courtroom to support our cases.
Which can often lead to delayed prosecutions, as was the case for Polite's family. It took about 10 years for your family to get justice.
Some sliver of justice, I would say.
Sergeant Ben Brown says the most important thing for all victims is to not give up the hope for justice.
There are things you can do to promote the case and try and get justice.
You're telling people to keep the pressure on people like you who investigate these cases.
Absolutely. You have to. You don't want them to ever forget.
Unfortunately, violence is a part of the American experience, and we need to do better in order to prevent these families from going through that type of pain.